Welcome. This is one of over 200 talks on the history of Western art. I've arranged the talks chronologically, starting with cave art through to art produced in the last few years. There's something here for everyone, so feel free to dip in where you fancy. This section is section 12 on Tudor and Stuart art, and I've divided this particular talk on Hampton Court into two parts. Part A is the Tudor Palace of Wolsey, and part B is the Baroque Palace built by Sir Christopher Wren. So let's go back to the beginning of the history of Hampton Court Palace. And I think many people know that Thomas Wolsey built Hampton Court and later gave it to Henry VIII. But fewer know that Wolsey was not the first to build on the site, and he never actually owned the site. In the Domesday Book, 1086, we find the manor was in the possession of Walter de St Valery. He was the grandson of William the Conqueror's aunt, and following the Norman Conquest was granted the manors of Hampton and Isleworth. Now, St Valery went on the First Crusade, and his grandson donated the estate to the military order of the Knights Hospitaller, which is also called the Order of Malta or Knights of Malta. Now, the Knights Hospitaller occupied the site from 1236. The order consisted of nuns and monks who cared for the sick, as we can see in the engraving on the right. The title at the top means to serve the weak, to reign the strongest. That is, the strongest rulers are those that care for the sick. One link back, the oldest part of Hampton Court, is the bell that still hangs above the astronomical clock in Clock Court, and the bell was cast in 1478 before the palace was built. Now, the Knights Hospitaller leased out the land to Giles Daubeny, who was the Lord Chamberlain, that is the most senior officer of the royal household, to Henry VII. And Daubeny built a manor house on the site, and the outline of this manor house can still be seen. It's laid out in red and black bricks in Clock Court. As you can see here, these bricks here on the court are the outline of the foundations that were found of Giles Daubeny's original manor house. Not much survives apart from the foundations. There's a few walls in the kitchens today from the original Daubeny manor house, which is this part back here with the kitchens. Coming on to 1514, Thomas Wolsey was granted a lease on the site as the Knights Hospitaller refused to sell him the freehold which he wanted. And in 1515 he began extensive building work, transforming what was a small manor house into a grand Renaissance-style palace suitable for entertaining royalty and foreign dignitaries. And in September of that year, 1515, was when he was made cardinal by Pope Leo X, the only cardinal in England at the time. Now, he didn't come from the aristocracy. He was born the son of Robert Wolsey, who's alleged to be a butcher. But recent evidence suggests he was actually a respected and wealthy merchant who may have traded in meat or livestock. And his father died at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, which was the battle that began the Tudor reign. Now, Thomas attended Ipswich School, and the family was wealthy enough to send him to Magdalen School and Magdalen College, Oxford. From there he became a priest, held various jobs before entering the service of Henry VII in 1507 as royal chaplain. Then in 1509 Henry VIII made Wolsey King's Almoner, which is the chaplain responsible for distributing money to the poor, and he obtained a seat on the Privy Council, and his affairs prospered. He became Lord Chancellor in 1515 and the King's closest advisor. This second portrait of Wolsey is from Cardinal College, now Christ Church. The college Wolsey founded in Oxford in 1527. He used the money from 30 corrupt monasteries that he dissolved. And then in 1529 is when he fell out of favour with Henry VIII because he'd failed to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He retreated to York and was summoned the following year to London, and on the way down from London, from York to London, he died of natural causes. So let's now consider Hampton Court itself, which, as I said, Cardinal Wolsey started in 1515. The actual building work is what started in 1515. This is as it is today, and this red area that I've marked is the west elevation of the original Wolsey Palace. The two wings either side were added later by Henry VIII after he took over in 1529. In the centre is the gatehouse, a typical Tudor structure. Originally it was over 5 stories high, and each gate tower was topped by a golden ball. This is a drawing that was done at the time of the West Front, and you can see the 5-story towers, and on top are the golden domes. The reason they're shorter today is they partly decayed, and in the 17th century they were demolished by Sir Christopher Wren as part of William and Mary's renovations. Now, in Wolsey's palace there was a moat around the original building, the smaller building, the bit I marked. But this, of course, was only for show. Also note the crenellations, which are typically seen on a castle, but again, here they're just for show. It's amusing, and an enemy's force could just climb in the windows. I mean, it's not a fortified castle. Why did they do it? Because it was fashionable. The Tudors loved to build mock medieval castles, because for Wolsey it sort of implied he had a long and illustrious ancestry. The moat was later filled in, and the current moat trench, there's no water in it, was dug in the 19th century, and you can just about make out, just in front of the entrance, heraldic beasts on pillars on the bridge. They were made in 1950s to replace an earlier set made in 1910 when the moat was excavated and the bridge restored. By the way, this wasn't the main entrance. It's the main entrance now. It's where visitors enter the palace. But in Henry's time, the main entrance was from the river, mainly because travelling by land was slow and very dangerous. Now, if we go through the gatehouse we see here in the centre, we enter the base court, or bas, meaning lower court. And then if we turn right in the base court, we see the oldest original brickwork. Now, in many Tudor manor houses, the outer courtyard was made of timber and canvas, but here you can see it's brick. and much of the brickwork and all the stonework was replaced in the 19th century. Originally in Tudor times, it was brightly coloured. The stone would have been whitewashed, the red bricks would have been painted bright red, and the black diaper work you can see was painted black. Now the chimneys you can see were original, but were originally chimneys, I should say, but these fancy chimneys were added in the 19th century. So in this base court, there are some 44 lodgings for guests, and normally the outer courtyard, the base court, would be for servants, but these were substantial lodgings. For the first time in England, the rooms had internal corridors, they had fireplaces, they had internal chimneys, and they had toilets, or garderobes as they were called then. So Hampton Court was not only prestigious, it was sort of state of the art. It was seen as innovative and much admired at the time. If you just turn around and look the other way, to turn left, we see the north side on the left, which has largely been rebuilt. And in the centre, you can see the Great Hall rising up. We'll take a quick look inside in a moment. And if we walk to the far end of the base court, we arrive, and you can just about see the edge of it on the right, we arrive at what's now called the Chamberlain Gate. And if you go into the gate, turn left and go up the flight of stairs, you reach the Great Hall. Her apartments were above the gate, but they were still being worked on when she was executed. There is this, if you go into Chamberlain Gate and look up at the ceiling, you'll see the intertwined initials of Henry and Anne, A.H., in the roof, but it's a 19th century copy. Sorry to disillusion you with all of these 19th century copies. This is the Great Hall. And again, the Great Hall is in many ways a fake. Great halls were a feature of medieval houses, but by the Tudor period, they would be seen as a reference back to the past. And the Great Hall, the way that it's set up at the moment, you can imagine when you go into it that the king would sit on the dais at the top overlooking all of the aristocracy, but that wasn't what it was used for. The king never used it on a daily basis. He sometimes would be fitted out for entertainment, like a Shakespeare a play for Elizabeth or entertainment for Henry, but typically it was used day to day for feeding up to 1,000 servants who would eat at long tables in 2 shifts. So it was like a canteen. The tapestries appear to have been made to fit the hall, so it's assumed they were only hung when a royal entertainment took place in the hall. I'll just mention now, as we're looking at the Great Hall, and I mentioned Shakespeare, this is much later than Henry VIII, but The Merry Wives of Windsor was performed in 1604, Measure for Measure. The same year, on Boxing Day, Comedy of Errors. 2 days later, Love's Labour's Lost, and A Midsummer Night's Dream. All would have been performed during Elizabeth's reign. And it's believed that some 7 Shakespeare plays were performed in the Christmas period, 1604, 1605. So where did the monarch eat? Henry VIII had Privy Chambers, a royal suite of rooms, privy meaning private, so a private suite of rooms, and visitors would first have to pass through the guard room to enter these private chambers, and the first room would be the presence or audience chamber with the throne in it, and it was here that he would meet important guests like ambassadors. And the inner rooms were for friends and special guests. By the way, if you look at the floor in the centre, you'll see there's a stone dais, which was apparently, you could imagine a big open fire on it, but the timbers of the roof have been analysed and they show no sign of soot, so it doesn't look as though there's ever been a fire there. It just assumed that it was placed there in the centre again to make it look like a medieval great hall. In winter, it's assumed the hall wasn't heated. Another thing is the hammer beam roof. In fact, the hammer beam roof wasn't needed to span the width, but it was built like this to look medieval and to symbolise royalty and chivalry. The roof is some 12 metres or 40 foot wide, and such timbers were readily available, so they could have put timbers directly across, but the hammer beam style was used to span wider spans, and you can see the bits sticking out from the wall. They are the hammers, and then the curved roof timbers are assembled like an inverted hull of a ship. So it enables very wide roof to be spanned when the timbers weren't available. But as I said, they were available for this roof, and here it was done for appearance's sake to look like a medieval great hall. Incidentally, the tapestries I mentioned I'll talk about next. They were extremely expensive because the thread in them, they used gold and silver thread, and it was a team of weavers would need about 3 years to produce one of these tapestries. Henry VIII collected tapestries. He had over 2,000, of which there are 28 still at Hampton Court, and there's 10 in the Great Hall telling the story of Abraham. They were commissioned in the 1530s or 40s, and this set is the most expensive in the collection, made in Brussels. This is one of them. Each tapestry like this, with its gold and silver thread, could cost as much as a warship. And the story of Abraham is told in 10 separate panels. 6 are in the Great Hall and 3 in the William III's Privy Chamber. This one depicts how Abraham found a wife for his son Isaac. He sent his servant Eliza with expensive gifts to find a suitable bride. But Eliza devised a test. He would go to the well and ask a young girl for a drink. If she said, "Drink and I will even water your camels," then she was the one. And to his surprise, a young girl immediately came out and offered to draw water for him to drink, as well as water to fill the troughs for all his camels. And Rebecca continued to draw water until all the camels were sated, proving her kind and generous nature and her suitability for entering Abraham's household. So I trust you've been looking at the picture while I've been talking, looking at the tapestry. You could see Rebecca, and you can see Eliza and the camels in the background, and you can see her on the left taking water from the well. So this is the layout of Wolsey's original palace. You can see at the top the west entrance that we started with, coming into the base court at the top, and you can see the 5-storey gatehouse. If we go through the ambling gate, we arrive at an inner courtyard, and on the left here is the main entrance from the river, and Hampton Court would have been a few hours travel by boat from central London. On the right here is where we were just looking, is the Great Hall. And further to the right over here are the kitchens. And at the bottom here is the chapel. So that's to give you a quick guide. Let's look briefly at the kitchens. They were an extension, a massive extension of the original Daubeny kitchens. But these kitchens weren't used to cook for Henry VIII. He had his own privy kitchens close to his Privy Chambers. And hygiene was upmost in Henry's mind and in Cardinal Wolsey's mind. There were many regulations. For example, Cardinal Wolsey forbid kitchen staff to go about naked, and pissing in the cooking hearth was expressly forbidden to, quote, better avoid corruption and all uncleanliness, which does engender danger of infection. So they did know that dirt was the cause of disease. Soap was available. It was made from wood ash, tallow and olive oil, but it was expensive. Toothpicks were used, followed by polishing the teeth with a linen cloth. So they paid great attention to their personal hygiene and to the hygiene in the kitchens where the food was prepared. Henry VIII actually extended the kitchens at Hampton Court in 1529, and they comprise some 55 rooms covering 3,000 square feet, staffed by 200 people who had to provide up to or more than 1,000 meals a day, twice a day, for the royal court. Fresh water was piped 3 miles. It wasn't taken out of the Thames. It was piped 3 miles from Combe Hill by lead pipe, which ran under the Thames. And the Tudor pipes and drains were still in use until the Victorian period, 1871. And many rooms in the Tudor period had taps and running water. And the King and Queen had bathrooms with running water. Returning to the western facade, as I said, Henry added 2 great wings and filled in the moat. On the right there is what was called the Great House of Easement. Communal toilets, in other words. Children find the name very amusing. It had some 14 latrines which emptied into the palace's main drain, not the moat, and then into the Thames, bypassing the moat. And for those with garderobes, toilets, they would also empty into the drains, and there were stone or lead urinals around the palace to discourage the use of the walls. Red crosses, like crucifixes, were painted on the walls to discourage the sacrilege of pissing on the holy symbol. So that's the Great House of Easement. And then on the other side is what was called the Board of the Green Cloth. Oh, that's the accounts office. And from that big window in the centre, they could watch and count the cattle and sheep that were being driven through the gate below to be slaughtered every day. The daily consumption was something like 80 to 100 sheep, a dozen fat beefs, a dozen and a half calves, and in addition to that, endless poultry, game, deer, boars, and many, many rabbits. And as well as all of that, there was something like 1,200 to 2,000 loaves, 600 gallons of beer, and 70 to 100 gallons of wine, all consumed every single day. The scale is difficult for us to imagine. There were something like 800 to 1200 who regularly attended the king's household. And during a major progress, it could swell to 2,000 to 3,000 because it would include nobles, attendants, soldiers, clergy, musicians, and foreign ambassadors, and all of their servants as well. And in addition, the Queen had an entourage of 160 to 200, and Edward VI's childhood household was 100 to 150. So they would eat up all the food in the area, so they had to move typically every 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the season and depending on the politics and the plague. Movement was essential. No single palace could sustain the court's demands for more than a few weeks. Food supplies were strained. Think about it, waste of all types accumulated. Game in the surrounding parks was quickly depleted. But Henry VIII had over 60 palaces, and of those, some 30 were major principal royal palaces, places like Hampton Court, Greenwich, Whitehall, Windsor, Richmond, and Eltham. So how did they move? Moving itself was a massive undertaking. Everything was moved from one palace to the next. They weren't all furnished. Everything had to be packed up, moved by ox and cart, then unpacked and set up without the king being inconvenienced. So what would happen was there would be an advance party, might leave a week in advance to start to prepare the next palace. There was something like 1,000 people involved in the move, excluding the royal household, and dozens, sometimes hundreds of carts would be used to move everything to the next palace, where it all had to be set up again. And this happened every few weeks. So let's go back through the Anne Boleyn Gate to the small courtyard inside, which is Clock Court. It's a bit difficult to read, but over the entrance there it says GR 1732. It was rebuilt during the reign of George II for the Duke of Cavendish, his second son. But I'm showing you because it gives some idea of the original state apartments in the Tudor period. When Henry VIII first went to Hampton Court in 1530, following Wolsey's death, Henry's apartments were on the first floor, the same floor as the Great Hall, which is, you can't see it here, but it's on the left-hand side of where we're looking. Queen Catherine, her apartments were on the floor above at the top, and Princess Mary had apartments on the ground floor. Anne Boleyn also had lodgings there, but we're not exactly sure where, possibly above what's now the Anne Boleyn Gate. And when she appeared at court, Henry gave her numerous presents, rode with her, walked with her, taught her archery and so on. And in 1531 was when Henry left Catherine at Windsor and rode the 12 miles to Hampton Court, never to see her again. I mentioned the King's Privy Chambers, and I said that the first chamber was the presence chamber. This is a drawing of the presence chamber, but the first room you had to go into was the guard room or great watching chamber. The guards would actually live and sleep in the room. They'd sleep on the floor. It was well furnished, had tapestries, had a buffet laden with gold plate. You could enter that room. It was used for entertainment and dining for the nobility. There was a page's chamber attached to the great watching chamber, where they would put on, the nobility would put on robes of state before going into this room, the presence chamber or throne room, which is where the formal meetings would take place. As you can see, there's a great chair or throne under a rich canopy, and it's facing the door. So we would come in and see the room as we see it here. No one of whatsoever degree was allowed near the king's chair or ever stand under the cloth of state. When the king wasn't present, courtiers were allowed to enter the room, but still had to doff their cap to the empty throne. This room was richly furnished and decorated, and it was the most expensively and gaudily decorated in the palace. Every surface was gilded and covered in ornamentation. Beyond this room, you can go into more private rooms, the king's Privy Chambers, and only those closest to the king could ever enter the Privy Chambers. And it was there that he took his meals, and there he would work on state business and relax. King's councillors were allowed to enter, members of the Privy Chamber, but beyond that there were more rooms which became known as the secret lodgings, and that would consist of the bedchamber, toilet or garderobe or stool chamber, a withdrawing room, a raying or robing room, a closet or oratory, and in some palaces a study. So a suite of rooms where the king could retire to be maybe with just one or two friends to relax completely. Also at Hampton Court, there was a library and a very ornate bathroom with marble walls and hot and cold running water. And the king had a secret passageway to the Queen's apartments, which had a similar layout. As I said, Henry was obsessed with cleanliness, and he waged a constant battle against dirt and smells. Many members of the court had disgusting habits. They would relieve themselves against walls, leave leftover food everywhere, wipe their hands on the king's tapestry, and the king feared this connection between dirt and disease, although technically at the time it was thought infection was transmitted by foul air, miasma, but they did understand that dirt also could be associated with disease. The king's servants had to get up at 6 a.m. to clean everything before the king rose at 8 a.m. So this is turning around and looking back at, you can see here why it's called Clock Court. At the top is the clock, and above it there's the Hospitaler's bell that I mentioned earlier. The clock, this is a better picture, more close-up picture of the clock. You can see it has many dials. There's a lot of information. The clock is some 10 feet across or 3 meters across, and it has copper dials that revolve at different speeds. I won't go through it in detail, but it's described in a lot more detail what each part of the clock does in my notes. But just briefly, there's a 24-hour clock around the outside. You can see it goes from 1 to 12 twice. You can see the hand with the sun on it that moves around, showing you the time on the 24-hour clock. And it also shows the month nearer the centre and the day of the month, the position of the sun in the ecliptic, the 12 signs of the zodiac, the number of days elapsed since the beginning of the year, the phases of the moon and the age of the moon in days, and the hour when the moon crosses the meridian and thus high water at London Bridge. A very important piece of information. Those who wanted to go into London, the preferred method of transport was a barge down the Thames, and at low water London Bridge had very dangerous rapids. Through the bridge the water would drop some 2 metres, so you could use this clock to decide the best time of leaving to get a smooth trip into London. And of course the river from about this point was tidal, so you could go to London with the tide ebbing out. The clock was restored in 1711, and in 1831 the whole mechanism was replaced, and a new clock movement was created in 1879, and again it was fully restored in 2007-2008 in time for the 500th anniversary of the accession of King Henry VIII. The original clock was installed in 1540. Let me move on. This is interesting because it's done by an Italian artist commissioned by Cardinal Wolsey. So he got a Florentine sculptor, Giovanni da Maiano, in 1521 to create 11 roundels of the Roman emperors. They've been moved several times, but this one is on the gatehouse on the west of Hampton Court. They've been restored recently, and some of them haven't yet been replaced. There are boxes there with a photograph of the roundels on the front of the box. But a number of them in Clock Court, there are 6, I believe, roundels in place. Also in Clock Court, this is surprising, it's Cardinal Wolsey's coat of arms. I say surprising because, of course, Cardinal Wolsey was accused of treason, and although he was never tried because he died on the way to the trial, all evidence of his occupation of Hampton Court was removed. The reason this survives is because it was covered for centuries by the coat of arms of Henry VIII, so it was hidden underneath. Something that this particular coat of arms of Wolsey was also by Giovanni da Maiano, and what it shows is his personal arms and the Christ Church College of Arms, which he founded. His arms were granted in 1514. They have, the colour's lost now, but they have a black background, the black symbolising constancy and wisdom. There's a silver cross symbolising his role in the church, a red lion who symbolises Pope Leo the 10th for obvious reasons, because it was Leo who'd made him cardinal, and the lion also symbolised bravery and royalty. There's red and white Tudor rose of the king above, 2 Cornish choughs from the arms of his namesake St Thomas Becket, a cardinal's hat at the top with 15 tassels on each side, and an archbishop's crozier and cross behind the shield. And this particular coat of arms is augmented with 3 gold leopards' faces. They are derived from the royal arms of England, and it shows he was allowed to augment his own personal arms with these leopards with permission of the king. And then finally underneath you can see Wolsey's motto, Dominus mihi adjuta, the Lord is my help, from verse 6 of Psalm 117. Adjuta has the implication of a particular mission or vocation, and the emphasis is on Lord. So it means that the Lord is our one and only true help in achieving the goals for which we were put on earth. Moving into the gardens, this is to the north and to the west of the palace, and it's the tilt yard where jousting took place. Directly to the north of the palace, you can just about make it out in the background, there were orchards and gardens where food was grown. And to the west of that, the tilt yard. In this original drawing, you can see there's 5 towers. We don't know what they were for exactly. It would appear that they were for viewing the jousting, although, as you can see, at least one lacks any windows to the west, which is where the jousting took place. It's also been suggested that they were used for the knights to ride in on horseback and dismount and change their clothes. Elizabeth I enjoyed watching jousting, and she would hold a celebration at Hampton Court on what was known as her accession day, the date that, or Queen's Day, 17th of November, when she became Queen. Although the accession day tilts were moved to Whitehall after 1581. It was a mixture of entertainment. Remember, by this stage, jousting no longer was an activity that actually took place on the battlefield. We've reached the point where battles were won by cannon. So again, it was a reference back to the medieval period. It was done for sport, and the lances that were used were made of very thin wood, and the point was to hit the opponent to smash the lance, and they kept count, and the person who'd smashed the most lances was the winner. That's the only tilt-yard tower that now remains, and in fact it's part of the cafe that's now there, which is called the tilt-yard. This gives a good example of what the walls of the rooms the king used would look like, how they were decorated, very ornate, burnished in gold. Although some of the king's secret rooms actually had plain linen fold wooden walls. This particular painting is usually displayed at Hampton Court, but it's not Hampton Court, it's showing Whitehall Palace, which you can see through the doorways either side. This is a painting that I describe in a lot more detail in another of my talks, but briefly, it's obviously Henry VIII in the centre. To his right is Edward, and to his left, Edward's mother, Jane Seymour, even though Jane had died about 8 years before this was painted. On the left of the picture, there's Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and on the right, Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. And in case you're wondering, the 2 people outside on the far left and far right are royal fools. Jane the Fool on the left and Will Somers, Henry's Fool, on the right. There are very few fragments of ornamentation that covered the tops of the walls in the palace, the walls of the rooms that were used by royalty. These pieces were found under the floors. They would be brightly coloured, and all the walls were also painted bright colours, except the servants' quarters, which would be painted white. This is known as the Wolsey closet. It's the only room in the palace that's close to the original Tudor decoration. You can see the linen fold wood walls, and the ceiling is believed to be close to the original ceiling. And you can see how lavish the decoration is, even for this small room. The upper parts of the walls are covered with paintings which have been restored. They're part of a series which were similar to those supplied to Henry VIII by Toto del Nunziato in 1530. And Toto came to England in 1519 and became court artist and sergeant painter to Henry VIII and Edward VI. A lucrative assignment. It wasn't all painting walls like this. The sergeant painter was involved in painting and gilding royal coaches and banners and so on. The ceiling, as I said, we believe is original, although it's been repaired. It contains the Prince of Wales feathers, so must date from after 1537. And it's possible to make out Wolsey's motto again, the Dominus Mihi Adivetor. But they are we believe a later antiquarian embellishment. They were added to the room later. So let's look at what the palace must have looked like in 1547. The main entrance was from the river, and you can see there's a covered walkway and then another gateway out to a small garden where I've marked a tower. This was for entertainment. It's a small man-made hill with a building on top and a path that went round and round up to the top with plants all the way up as you walked up to the top to get a view of the gardens. The ponds you can see up to about at the top in the centre are now sunken gardens, but they were ponds then that had a stock of freshwater fish for the kitchens, and labourers were actually paid to ladle water out of the Thames to fill the ponds in the night times. I assume they got water from the Thames upstream to avoid the sewage outlet. And it was a major feature in 1528. Anne Boleyn begged Henry to send her freshwater shrimps and carp from Hampton Court. This is you can see in the centre, where the part I marked in red, there's a courtyard which was called the Cloister Green Court. It's now, when it was rebuilt by Christopher Wren, it's now the Fountain Court. The base court at the top is the one that we first looked at. And that brings me to the end of the first part of this talk. In the second part, I will be talking about how most of this part of the palace that was marked in red, this part here, was demolished and rebuilt in the English Baroque style by Sir Christopher Wren. And I take the court, the way the court used the palace through the Victorian period, briefly up to the present day. But that brings me to the end of today's talk on the Tudor history of Hampton Court Palace. Goodbye for now, and I hope you'll join me when I talk about the second part of the story of Hampton Court. Goodbye for now.